Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we thought we would approach a holiday that most people around the world are familiar with, but certainly how we go to celebrate this particular holiday has its differences. And that is the holiday known as Christmas. After all, many families around the world have unique traditions that they like to use to celebrate and keep things alive, especially when it comes to the family spirit. Today, though, we thought we would go a little bit deeper and explore traditions that help prepare our hearts for the God who, quote, bends low to enter our world and our lives during what is known as Advent season. What we're going to learn about is St. Francis of Assisi. He was the 13th century saint that created what was known as the first nativity scene. And we'll also learn how nativity sets, Advent wreaths, walking labyrinths, candles, and carols, as well as Christmas cards, will help do that very thing in preparing our hearts. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today a guest who is a United Methodist minister, a trained spiritual director, author, and retreat leader, and is currently the director of the Franciscan Spiritual Center, which you can find located in Milwaukee, Oregon. I'd like to welcome our guest, Reverend Larry Peacock, as we talk about his book, The Living Nativity. Larry, thank you for being on the program today.
Thank you so much for having me. Delighted to be with you.
Now, I really enjoyed as I was reading through your book. Very small and simple, by the way, for a lot of people to come to understand. But, you know, when you get a hold of books like this, my instinct as well as my experience tells me you want to pay attention because there's a lot of deep thought and a lot of things that you can actually embrace and realize, boy, I've learned quite a bit in these simple pages here. Tell us how it got started for you when you came to explore this.
I grew up in Michigan, so I experienced snow and Christmas trees and candles, and I probably would have said Christmas was my favorite time of year. And then when I got into ministry, I was fortunate to serve a church in Malibu, California, which did not have any snow, but had people interested in how do we recover or find some traditions to help us celebrate this very significant Christian holiday. And so people were interested in candles and walking a labyrinth. They were interested in how do we move through the days of Advent with more mindfulness. And then I would say the third thing that came around was I tried to retire in Portland, Oregon, and ended up finding the Franciscan Spiritual Center and their needs for a director and my experience. I had moved from Boston after directing a retreat center for 11 years. They said, well, you're not Roman Catholic, but you certainly seem to have a Franciscan heart. So I'm holding all these things about Michigan and rituals and prayers that I had written and discovering St. Francis, who in the 12th century is credited with the first living nativity. So I'm holding all these things. So that's the long answer. And the short answer is somebody I'd worked with, an editor I'd worked with on my first book, Openings, a Daybook of Saints, Sages, and Prayers, called me up and said, we're thinking of an Advent book. Would you be interested now that you're retired? I had to tell her, well, I'm not retired, but yes, I think from Michigan to California to Oregon, I think I've got some pieces to put together and maybe a little bit different than what the Upper Room books have done before. So I had all this experience and memory and prayers that I'd written, and it just took somebody to say, hey, we're looking, and I said, I think this will be a good fit, and made a proposal. They accepted it, and I had to start writing.
Well, there you go.
there you go.
Now, here's the first thing I want to ask before we get into who St. Francis of Assisi is exactly what is Advent? How many days is it?
Well, Advent, which is celebrated in a lot of churches, it's 4 Sundays or 4 weeks before Christmas. And it probably wasn't until the 11th century that it was defined as 4 weeks. There were some areas of the world celebrated 5 weeks. Somewhere around the 4th century, there was a defined period of Christmas in preparation for Christmas, just like there is a defined period of Easter with a preparation for Easter called Lent. So there are these two parallel movements in the church, one getting ready for Christmas and one getting ready for Easter. So somewhere, between the 4th and 6th century, you discovered there were sermons talking about this is the second Sunday of Advent. So already there was some purpose for how do we get ready for this most significant event, the birth of Jesus, the sense of God, as Francis would say, bending low to be with us. So from, say, people are celebrating in the 6th century, 11th century, it became, let's do just 4 Sundays. So it's the 4 Sundays and the weekdays leading up to Christmas. This year it's a bit, well, it's pretty typical because the first Sunday of Advent this year was on December the 1st. So we actually have 24 days. But sometimes you have more or less because it begins with the 4th Sunday before Christmas. And then all the Sundays, or all the 4 Sundays plus the days that lead up to Christmas.
Now, let's go ahead and talk about St. Francis of Assisi. Now, first of all, when people think of saint, they probably think of some quiet, solemn individual, that kind of really, is to himself sort of a thing. But this man was actually quite different than people might picture. In fact, you write in your book that in his early years he enjoyed partying, so to speak. Let's talk about who he was.
Well, he would have, in his early days, been probably the life of the party. Evidently was a very gregarious person. Came from a merchant class family, so he had some money that he could provide funds for the party, and was well liked. Had a a good voice, and was also bitten like many people with the hero's journey, and thought that would probably lead him to war. And so he tried to be hero, and there is a battle between the two cities, between Assisi and Perugula, at which he was captured and imprisoned. So that kind of soured him a little bit on war. And when he went home and recovered after his dad ransomed him, he was trying to figure out what to do with his life. And then the Crusades were happening, and he decided I'll get armor and I'll look really good, and this time will work. And he didn't even make it after one day. He had a vision that God said, "Who do you serve, the master or the servants?" He said, "Well, you serve the master." And he said, "So why aren't you serving me?" That was kind of his image in the dream, which turned him around, and he took his joy and his delight and discovered it was in all of God's people, and discovered it was in nature, and loved creation. So there's stories told of him dancing as he walked along, and picking up 2 sticks and playing them, and like a violin, and singing. Stories of him greeting lepers who in those days were not to be approached, let alone touched, and he both approached and ended up embracing lepers. And he was such a contagious spirit that people decided to join with him. And so pretty soon he had a following of brothers. And later, one person that he knew in Assisi named Claire, she ran away, ran away from home. And so then a group of sisters became followers of St. Francis. They developed their own order, the Poor Clares. But a community developed around this person, contagious personality, who believed in following Jesus as closely as he could. So it meant living with poverty, trusting God to take care of them, loving all kinds of people, which found a warmth in people who often were forgotten about, or if they didn't have money, didn't have a sense that God loved them. So he was a pretty charismatic figure, living very simply, but very joyfully, and willing to live that out in a way.
Now, and talking about Advent, what was really enjoyable to read about were the different things that actually go on each day, and you share stories not only personally, but for instance, how we go about each day and what we do as part of the ritual. For instance, day one, you talk about candles and light, and that has a lot of significance, especially when it comes to, for instance, Jesus saying, be that light, light your candles, and don't let that be extinguished. Let's go ahead and go into the significance about candles and light itself.
Well, candles have, that was one of the things I discovered, have a pretty long history. They could have been around for maybe 5,000 years. So the image of light, especially in early days when the seasons were changing and things seemed to be getting darker. So being able to have light was a sign that you're going to have another day and that the world wasn't ending. Certainly the image of light in Scripture, Jesus used the words, I'm the light of the world. The prologue to John says that light has come into the world and the world, darkness has not put it out. So there are these images, important images of light. And then related to Advent, with 4 Sundays, then they thought, well, let's light candle for each Sunday. So then a tradition of Advent wreaths, or the 4 candles of Advent, emerged. So every Sunday, and there were sometimes agreed upon themes, and other times there were people made up their own particular themes, but you'd light 1 candle, and the second Sunday you'd light 2 candles, and likewise to get to the 4th Sunday, and then often there would be a 5th candle lit on Christmas Day, which would usually be white. And colors got associated with the candles. Some traditions had blue candles. Some traditions had purple candles. Some traditions said, well, this is kind of a somber, dark period. Let's have some extra joy in the middle of Advent. And so the 3rd Sunday was often called the Joy Sunday, and many people picked, well, let's have a pink candle instead of the somber purple or the dark blue. So there are traditions, and some people are more following a particular tradition, and other people say the 4 candles are good. If you don't have evergreens, that's okay. Let's just use candles as a way to mark our journey towards Christmas. One of the earliest discovery of candles was a school that had 24 candles, and so that was a lot of candles to light every day as they got closer. So I think the 4 candles became more typical, particularly in churches. But lighting lots of candles on dark winter nights seems to be a good thing.
Now, one of the things that really came to mind here, because after each one of these, you also say that we ponder, and then after that, then you have a prayer, and so you have quite a few prayers in here. One of the things that I found tied with how people typically look at Christmas, especially in America, and its commercialism, is the idea of longings or desires. But what we talk about here is something much different. How about that?
I think as a kid, certainly the longing and desire was to open presents. So that I think in Advent what we're able to do is take that longing and desire and put it towards something that is more meaningful. So obviously longing for the birth of Jesus, and then longing, what did Jesus bring? Well, Jesus brought peace, joy, forgiveness, kindness. So all these qualities that one sees in Jesus become part of that deep longing. And music in particularly picks up the longing for what's coming. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. That's one of the refrains from an Advent song written by a Methodist, Charles Wesley, Come Thou Long Expected Jesus. And then you've got this wonderful Advent song, O Come, Emmanuel, which is has a series of, each of the refrains kind of talks of an image that is in the midst of Christmas, and then is sung about in O Come, Emmanuel. So that sense of deep longing, but it's a longing not just personal, but it can be a longing for changes in society, longing for more openness and receptivity. And the story itself, with the shepherds coming, there's certainly, shepherds were not on the upper edges of society, they were on the lower edges, and then you have people coming from the east. So you've got an international flavor of the three magi, although we don't know in Scripture if there were three. We kind of assume there were three because there were three gifts mentioned. But they came from some distance. They would not have been local folks, may have been persons of color. And you've got the poor shepherds who are dirty and with sheep, and they make it to the manger scene. So there's this sense that the coming of Jesus reorients the world the way God intended, that all persons might find peace and joy and harmony. And this place, it happens in a stable.
Pretty amazing too. Now, how about the prayers themselves? Now, were these? How did they come to be created, as far as what their intention is, and so forth?
How did the prayers come to be?
Yes.
Let me say also a word about the ponderings, and that was, after writing a day's reflection, there are some questions just to think about, because we can read things and then we go on our way. So I was trying to come up with some questions or things to think about that you might carry through the day. And just yesterday I had a person come see me at the Franciscan Spiritual Center. She said, I'm reading your book and I'm working through the questions, and she brought out her journal and she was kind of writing responses to each pondering questions. And often I would put 3 or 4 questions. So she's beginning to fill up her journal. She's taking it more seriously, perhaps than anybody outside I'd noticed, but was really wrestling with it and brought some questions. So that was interesting to see how one person was really using that as an invitation to reflect so deeply that She wanted more conversation about what was being raised for her. And then the prayers were to kind of take the reflection and the pondering and to lift it up in a prayer. And I think it comes from my experience in spiritual direction when I've both received spiritual direction and as a spiritual director. When you listen to somebody, and in particular, I'm thinking of a director I had. She listened to me so closely for an hour, and then she would say, "Shall we pray?" And it was like she lifted up my whole hour-long conversation and kind of held it in the presence of God for blessing. And that just felt so encouraging that I wanted to find prayers that maybe people would read once or twice, or maybe there would be a line that would stick with them through the time. And so some of the prayers are prayers that I developed when I was in Malibu serving the church. So I will admit that I kept a lot of the prayers that I wrote each Sunday. And since I was at the Malibu church for 20 years, I had a lot of prayers that I could look at. And some of them, I didn't use. But others, I would say, I like these 3 lines out of these 12 lines. So then I would say, let's see what prayer will come for each section. One of my favorite prayers is the Christmas Eve prayers. And most of the prayers that I wrote back then and the prayers that I write when I'm leading worship, they usually come out of a period of silence and reflection. And they're usually written by pen and paper. I find my creativity comes writing with pen and paper, not so much on the computer. But I remember getting ready for a Christmas Eve service and sitting in the sanctuary in silence, and the line came to me, "Can one night make a difference? Can one star outshine all others? Can one child shake up the world? Yes, 1,000 times yes." And that was the beginning of a Christmas Eve prayer that I sometimes still go back to, even if I'm not leading worship, just to hear those lines again. And the prayer went on, if you don't mind me reading it. "Was ever there such a night when stars shone bright, when angels formed a heavenly chorus and shepherds quaked? Was ever there such a birth when a baby's cry meant that God is now here? Was ever there a moment like now when we let the majesty and simplicity of the story touch our hearts, when we draw closer to family and God, when we sing with deep feeling and overflowing joy? Oh, this is the night. This is the night. Oh, that our tongues were like bells to ring out the joy, and that our hands were like drums to sound out the beat of new life. Oh, that our voices sounded like the heavenly choir, and that our hearts could hold the wonder of it all. Oh, that our knees were strong enough to kneel forever in awe, and that our eyes could open wide enough to see glory shining in every star and in every person." I still get kind of cheers when I know that, wow, somewhere that prayer came from. But I just love the echo of it. Can one night make such a difference? And for some people who show up maybe only on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day services, you hope that awakens something within them. And then I wrote an Advent prayer for this series, and it has some lines, but it has this one line that I don't know where it came from. But several people said, "Oh, I love that prayer." And the last line goes, Loving God, help us keep alert in this Advent season. Help us slow down for prayer, to stand up for justice, to breathe deeply your love each day. Open us and make us ready for you. I just love that. I don't know where it came from. Slow down for prayer, stand up for justice, and breathe deeply your love every day. Those are pretty good words, I think, to take us through every day, to slow down, to stand up when needed, and to breathe deeply, be aware of that. Okay. Anyhow, I'm just amazed that I've penned these words. It's almost like they come through me, and I'm touched by I write when I go back and go, wow, where did that come from?
Well, and there you go when you say that it comes through you. That's when I feel that we're most connected with Spirit, and when people have experienced this, they know what you're talking about. It's sort of like, it was you taking the action, but somehow something worked through you and you just sort of disappeared all at the same time. And it's an exciting thing. And so when you say in your book about, say, God bending low, let's go ahead and give our listeners an idea of what that means.
The Franciscan experience and understanding of God is that sense that God intended to love us from the moment of creation. And the coming of Jesus was that sense, I need to be close, God needing to be close to creation. So bending low to be with us. And Francis, in those days, wanted people to experience and to know how much God cared for them, no matter who they were or what station in life they might find themselves. So when he was trying to think of what's a way to do that, he came up with this idea of let's reenact Bethlehem. And in a place called Greccio, which is the hill country north of Assisi, he had a place, several places he liked to pray. In fact, he liked to pray outside often. But there is a cave that was owned by a person named John in Greccio who was fairly well off. He might even have been like the mayor of the town of Greccio. But he became a follower of Francis. And Francis said, do you have a space I can use? Maybe one of the caves I used to pray in. I would like to reenact what happened at Bethlehem. So can you get some straw? Can you find a place that we could put that? Could you find a donkey, a mule, and ask some animals? And can you bring them there on Christmas Eve? And then let's spread the word and tell all the people to light torches and march in procession. And there we are going to reenact what happened at Bethlehem. And that was the first living nativity. The legend that grew up around it was somebody said they saw a baby in the manger. Although Francis didn't put one there, but somebody said it looked like there was a baby in, and actually in Greccio now, there is this stone altar manger that has a little dip in it where they would have put the straw. And one of the legends is that somebody saw Francis bend over and kiss a baby in the straw. But that John didn't put a baby there. They just had a donkey, and a mule or an ass, some animals there. And Francis led basically a midnight service, a midnight carol service with people singing, and Francis telling the story of the baby born in Bethlehem. And the biographer of, or one of the first biographers of St. Francis, Thomas Chileno, said, on that night, simplicity was honored and Greccio was made a new Bethlehem. One of the things that the Franciscan Spiritual Center does is we lead pilgrimages to holy places. Assisi is one of them. I'm also taking a group to St. Cuthbert's Way next year and also to walk the Camino. But we took a group to Assisi a couple years ago and went to Greccio. And it's up high on a hill, and there in this cave, there is the stone that had the straw, and it's behind there that Francis told the Christmas story with animals behind him and a crowd of people with torches in front of him. But I love that image of out of Greccio became a new Bethlehem. And I think that's an image we can use, that wherever we are, we can have our own Bethlehem moments. We can have a sense of God's presence. We can catch a glimpse of lasting joy. Maybe it's an experience of healing or forgiveness. So out of the very ordinary things of life, like Greccio, which even now is a really small little town, you have to take a long bus ride up the hill to get there. But when you climb the stairs, there's this little cave, and it really is a tiny cave with a stone with an indent. But they left it pretty simple. There is a light shining down on it, and there's a fresco, a painting behind it of the Bethlehem story. But it's a very simple place. It's now surrounded. There's a larger chapel nearby. But the humility and the lowliness of that place was what Francis wanted people to see, that God has come to a simple place like Bethlehem, to a simple, humble place like Greccio. God cares for you. God bends low to be with you. And it evidently was a joyous night, and Francis was pretty, Thomas says, Francis was so excited. He was lit up almost like a candle. He was so excited about being able to reenact what happened at Bethlehem. I wanted to entitle my book The Second Manger. So if the first manger was Bethlehem, the second manger was Greccio. And maybe the third manger is wherever we have a creche set, wherever we are. But the editors liked the title, The Living Nativity. I said, okay, I'll still talk about the second manger sometime.
Now, as you mentioned the Camino, you talk about labyrinths and spirals, and I found that this should be very important for people to know, especially in a day, with technology so prevalent, and our distractions, that we don't really take time to reflect and to ponder, and walking is certainly one of those things. So let's go ahead and talk about labyrinths and spirals.
Labyrinth has been around for a long, long time. And labyrinth is different than a maze, because a maze is a path that tries to get you lost, whereas a labyrinth is it's basically a single path maze, but it only leads in one direction, and that is to the center. It may wind you around on all sides of a circle or a square, but its intention is to slow you down, make you pay attention, to put one foot in front of the other, because in the twists and the turns, you could get lost. But if you stay on the path and you trust and you're aware of being on the path, you will end up in the center. I have had some people who said, I didn't end up in the center, and they said, I guess it's symbolic of my distracted life. I get distracted from my purpose or my path in life, and said, it happened again. And it was just a simple labyrinth that takes you maybe 20 minutes, 10 minutes to walk. And she said, I couldn't believe, this friend who told me, I couldn't believe that I got distracted in only 10 minutes and somehow stepped off the path. But you're right, we're so busy. We're hectic, we're anxious, our minds are always thinking about things. Who knew that cell phones would be attached to our wrists, it seems permanently. So laying aside our mental to-do list and letting aside the devices that we carry and enter into a labyrinth, a walking prayer, can be pretty revelatory, either that we're distracted or this was a moment of complete awareness of one step at a time, and being so aware that when I got to the center, it was almost like a deep breath, a deep sigh. So the labyrinth, in many traditions, almost always a circular path leading to the center. In the Malibu United Methodist Church that I served for 20 years, we built a labyrinth outside. But it wasn't until after I'd been there a while that we actually built one outside, so we could take people on full moon labyrinth walks, or anybody could walk the labyrinth. Even kids at our nursery school would skip it or run it, and all of it was welcome to the labyrinth. But what we did before we had the labyrinth was we had a fairly large open space up in the front of the church, and we would move the furniture up there, the altar and the other things, and we would take evergreens and we would string it in a spiral. And then one evening during Advent, we would invite people to walk the spiral. So it was like a labyrinth, but it basically just wove in a circle into the center. And we would give people a candle, usually tucked in an apple, because the apple would hold the candle, and invite people to walk into the center. And in the center, we would put a larger, like Christ candle, a big candle. Invite people to light their little candle stuck in an apple, and as they walk out somewhere, to leave it down on the path as a way to tell others to light the path for people going in. There were probably only, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 concentric circles leading into the center. So you had to walk slowly, because if you walk too fast, you might get a little dizzy. But it was a simple evening service with candles, a darkened sanctuary, and again, just taking the time to place one foot in front of the other, to not step on the evergreens, and just trust that as you kept walking closer and closer to the center, you would get to the center. And you could pause there for a time of prayer, light your candle, and then as you walk out, leave your candle down someplace on the edge as a marker for other people to guide them. And I suppose you could say it's a little bit like the stars that guided the 3 magi, or however magi there were. They were following light, and the brightest star led them to the place where Jesus was. So in our own ways, with a spiral, evergreen spiral, it made the sanctuary smell real nice. It was nice to have an evening service, which we don't have so many evening services, and there's something about the darkness that can help people be a little more reflective. And now that I'm at the Franciscan Center, we keep walking. We just walk longer distances, about 110 or 120 kilometers, and we'll end up on the holy island of Lindisfarne in our first walk, and then we'll end up in Santiago at the cathedral in Spain on the Camino walk. So we just keep walking towards light. It's good to be be thoughtful and to let go of a lot of distractions and to-do list, and to give ourselves over to what happens in the silence. Somebody said silence is God's first language. I think it was Thomas Keating. Silence is God's first language. And if we can practice being silent, we can perhaps hear something. Somebody else said, never trust any idea that wasn't shaped first in deep silence. So finding ways to cultivate an openness and awareness to silence is good to discover the holy.
It's really quite fascinating. I think people find in your book, The Living Nativity, for instance, the idea of the manger and how that came to first be created, and its intention behind it, and in looking at Christmas as the holiday away from how we typically tend to view and experience Christmas. I remember it's been so many years since I felt like that Christmas spirit, that Christmas feeling. But when you do, you realize that isn't something you find in a gift. You know, it isn't really in the anticipation that tomorrow morning I wake up and I get to pull out the treats out of a stocking hanging over the fireplace. But it's a very unique feeling that flows through you, and it feels like it doesn't last, although at the same time it's eternal. Because once you've experienced it, it stays with you for life. Mm-hmm. You know, it's an amazing thing. And then you realize that there are times throughout the year that you can experience it again. And to me, that seems to be the real gift of Christmas and the holiday itself, is to realize as this flows through you back to the candle and the light, your light brightens. And it's through this that you have the abundance of a particular gift that you can go out and you can give to others so that they could do the same thing. Mm-hmm. And it's quite a miraculous way of looking at the idea of giving the gift, if you will. And it comes wrapped in you.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about, as I was reading through the book, and it's one of those that I want to go through again and read, because it just changes your perspective on things. Because there was a time from personal experience that I experienced a very dark time as my son simply went into the hospital, and I believe it was on the 17th of December. And that's where he stayed in for about 4 months. We went into, ICU. And when you're in a situation like that and your son's in a coma and here comes Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and so forth, and you see how others are experiencing Christmas around you in that moment, it changes a lot of things. Mm-hmm. It really does. And I mean that it does, although it was devastating, at the same time it was in itself its own miracle. Because I began to think about people around the world who must be experiencing pretty close to the same thing that I was. And it was amazing how much my universe expanded in those moments in time. Both heartbreaking and miraculous all at the same time. And so that being said, you realize you put away the petty things, the small things, and there's a lot of them. And you realize what you actually have doesn't take a credit card or a dollar bill to go out there and do that. It doesn't really take, how should I put this, energetic intention. It just simply is, and it flows through and out of you. As you were saying earlier, it just comes through me. And when people can begin to experience that, it certainly changes you forever, and you're going to want more of that, more than anything else.
Yeah. Well, in many ways, your hospital experience was a Bethlehem moment, even there, to see the grace of doctors and nurses and care and prayer that surrounded your son, and other people are going through the same thing. But even there, hopefully there's experience of God bending low, of a sense that we're not alone in this. In fact, the song, O Come, Emmanuel, Emmanuel means God with us. So that longing for God with us is met in reality in Christmas. That sense, wow, God loves us so much that Jesus is that sign of God with us. Wow.
And when you think of the Christmas songs or carols, if you will, I think probably my all-time favorite would be Silent Night. And it's simply just because the song is as quiet as it sounds. So there's that idea that you lose and you find yourself. Here's a song, you hear the words, you hear the music, but yet why does it sound so silent?
Yeah. Although some people say it might not have been that silent on that night in the manger, given the sounds that babies make. But that's a good contrast, that babies cry is a sign of life. So even on a silent, holy night, the signs of life, babies cry, and angels singing to shepherds. That must have been pretty incredible. However, those shepherds experienced the wonder to get up and move. Everybody moves towards the light, whether it's shepherds or people from the east. We move to those holy experiences because there's something important. And like both the shepherds and the Magi, they didn't stay in Bethlehem, but hopefully carried that gift, that experience back with them, a changed life to share with others.
And one of the things people can come to do is to allow themselves to share in your book, The Living Nativity. How can they go about finding your book?
If they're in Oregon or near Portland, we have some in our. We have a gift shop, a little bookstore at the Franciscan Spiritual Center in Milwaukee, Oregon, essentially Portland. And you can probably find it at bookstores. I know it's on Amazon. So, and it's published by Upper Room Books in Nashville. So you can Google Living Nativity, and actually they used to have, hopefully they still have a website of activities related to the Living Nativity as a part of the Upper Room bookstore, the publisher in Nashville. So any of those places, or ask for it. That's always good for publishers and people when bookstores call and say, we need copies of the Living Nativity. And it's good to read anytime. I think the prayers are can be used at multiple times, and it's good to do with groups. There's also some post-Christmas entries, so it actually takes you up to Epiphany, which is the 12th day after Christmas, which is the traditional feast of when the Magi, the three Magi, come. I generally like Magi because we don't know how many there were. We don't even know if they were all men. So anybody who's an astrologer or maybe a mystic, we'll put all of them with the Magi, and all people heading to Bethlehem, heading to the light, heading to peace. One other thing to say about St. Francis, because there was the hope at Christmas that, as the angel said, peace and goodwill to all, Francis, after his war experiences, became very interested in how do we make peace. And he journeyed in the middle of the Fifth Crusade into the Muslim camp where there's fighting between the Christians and Muslims. And he walked into the Muslim camp and gave his traditional greeting, may God give you peace, and ended up having conversations with Malik al-Kamil, the Sultan, and stayed for some period of time and learned about the prayers of the Muslims. They didn't evidently communicate language, but they discovered a mutual respect for each other's faith, so much so that it changed Francis, that when he got back and spoke with his brothers, he encouraged them to live at peace when they were living in Muslim communities and not worry about converting them. He found them kindred spirits, much to the chagrin of the Fifth Crusade, which were trying to kill the Muslims. Francis is trying to figure out a way how not to kill people. And hence we have the peace prayer of St. Francis, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Even though Francis probably didn't say the words quite exact way, he probably took seriously the angel's words for peace and goodwill to all, and he lived that out. He believed that was important, and I think that's an important message for us today, where we're so keen on being against other folks as opposed to discovering ways that we can be respectful and be people of peace and live with peace and kindness. Maybe that's a good message for us again this Christmas.
Now, one of the last things I would like to talk about before we close is the idea behind Christmas cards. Now, I think it's really unique that when you think about goal setting, one of the number one things they tell you to do when it comes to setting goals is to simply write it down. So therefore, people wonder about that, but the truth is you write it down, you bring it from a metaphysical to a physical reality. In other words, you're giving your goal or your idea birth just by simply doing that. You make it solid and real. Would that sort of be the same thing behind a Christmas card and the best wishes that people tend to send in those?
I think so. When they look at the history of Christmas cards, they're looking at the first published cards, probably in the 19th century at least. Some people think England was a place, but there's a small note when you read about the first Christmas cards that were published and maybe used in businesses and other things. There's a small note that says, well, before that there were handwritten notes. So it's like, oh, Christmas cards. We invented Christmas cards. Well, what was first was people sending notes, however that happened, writing letters. So I like Christmas cards. We get a lot of photo cards now, which I like. But I must admit, we too have succumbed to sending out email greetings, and there's a part of me that misses those evenings when you put on Christmas music, and even though we may have wrote a Christmas letter which we Xeroxed off back in the old days, I would always take time to write notes to people. And then you're really thinking of them. What am I going to say to them? Maybe I haven't written to them since last Christmas. What's my wish for them? What have I heard from them? How do I send my greetings, my encouragement, or my prayers? And just know that, well, I'm going to spend an hour just adding little notes, but every time I write this note, I'm bringing somebody to mind. And as I'm folding the letter and stuffing it in the envelope and addressing the envelope, yes, it takes time, but it's the time that this person is in my mind and in my heart. And email is a lot quicker, but I'm not sure it carries that intention that you speak of, whether it's learning habits or making to-do lists. How do we bring that mindfulness, that kindness and caring for persons that we care about? Mm-hmm. And certainly phone calls can do it, emails can do it, but there's something special about getting a handwritten note. That's one of the things one of my jobs as a director at the center is to encourage people to be supportive of groups, including the Franciscan Spiritual Center. And I think if somebody takes the time to send some money, I can take enough time to do a handwritten note. So that's what I'm doing this Christmas as people are generous and remember nonprofit organizations like ours. I love writing handwritten notes to people and thanking them. So if Christmas cards does it, if writing notes, if phone calls do it, I'm reading a book of selections from Mother Teresa, who says besides the poverty she encountered, she would say probably the worst poverty was loneliness. And so she spoke so often about praying for people and being in touch with people because, and she said particularly in the United States when people from the States would ask her, what should we do? She would say, pray and be connected with those who feel forgotten and lonely. That's also a good Christmas message. How do we reach out at Christmas time to those that whose Christmas may not be as bright and joyful? They may have lost somebody to death or to opioid crisis or to gun violence. How do we reach out with words of care and kindness and peace?
Absolutely. I know as you were talking about the handwritten Christmas card, and I say this out to the listeners, in the world of work years ago, I had decided to do that very thing where the people at work I would actually get, a variety box of Christmas cards, and I literally sat down and I wrote out each card with a message that pertained to how I connected with them personally. So could be guaranteed that each and every Christmas card was different. Now, here was the funny thing, the unique phenomenon, and I say this to listeners out there because it's a wonderful experience. First of all, it seemed like a lot of work, as you're doing it because you realize I'm doing one, I'm doing three, and I've got 40 or 50 of these to do. But as you get into do it, you sit down, throw on your favorite movie or whatever the case is, and make it an enjoyable experience, not something diligent like it's work. Make it enjoyable. Sit on the couch, relax, and here was the thing. So I found that I delighted in it because, in my mind I'm connecting with them. I'm realizing, this is my joke or my nickname to them, those particular things. So the message actually came out to be not extensive, but certainly it would fill one side of a card and sometimes a card and a half page. And here was the unique phenomenon. So I'd hand them the card, and you'd kind of get a, oh, thanks, which, a nice cordial thank you. But what happened was they would open the card and realize, oh, you actually wrote something in here besides just Merry Christmas. And that changed everything, and you could feel the energy of the place from these people bouncing on their toes. And it was about a year ago, I think I did the very same thing to about 60 people. And it was just not only an amazing experience to me because people realized, man, you put a lot of work into this. And it was like, yeah, but it's some of the most enjoyable work that I've done. And to this day, a lot of them were like, man, getting a Christmas card from you is kind of a thing, but there it is, it was more, I think it was more enjoyable for me to do it than it probably was for them to receive it, although they enjoyed receiving, that special message with that special little thing that was unique to just the two of us, kind of a thing, very personable.
Yeah.
Like what you're talking about. So
yeah, bless you for doing that.
Well, I got blessed all the way, that's for sure. But when you say about taking that time to handwrite versus the email, the email's nice, but, it's not that same thing as it's in fact, even a couple of them said, yeah, I put it on my bedside table there, it's right there, kind of a thing. And it was just so sweet, to hear the kind of reactions that had occurred as a result of something like that. To me, that's, really the essence of Christmas as well. So
yeah.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being on the program today, and first of all, sharing the Living Nativity, your book, and you suggested how they can go about finding it. Is there a website people can go visit?
There isn't a website of the Living Nativity. They can certainly contact me at the Franciscan Spiritual Center.
Okay.
And, our website there is francispctr.com.
Okay.
And I get email there, and happy to respond. And my other book, Opening, a Day Book of Saints, Psalms, and Prayers, has more prayers in it. If you liked Living Nativity, you might find that's available on Amazon as well.
Well, very good. Again, the book is The Living Daylights, Preparing for Christmas with St. Francis.
The Living Nativity.
The Living Daylights. I'm sorry. The Living Nativity. But we are looking for the light. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
Larry, thank you so much for being on the program and sharing this with our listeners today. And have a wonderful holiday.
Blessings to you, Daniel. Thanks so much.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. You can also discover more at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter to keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50, as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.